Hi, everybody. This is Nicole Solomon, co host of the Celluloid Mirror. Sean and I are taking a little summer break and thus do not have a new episode for you today. And instead, we are resharing our very first episode from way back in 2020. It is entitled The Audience Must Suffer, and on it, we discuss Michael Haneke's Funny Games as well as Transformers the movie. That is the cartoon from the 80s, Transformers the movie, not one of the Michael Bay monstrosities. The conversation focuses on how both films horrified audiences through their subversions of genre expectations, but you can hear more about that for yourself in just a moment. Sean and I will be back with a brand new episode of the Celluloid Mirror featuring two more fine films as well as a very special guest in just 2 weeks' time. Until then, enjoy this very special rerun, and remember, the audience must suffer.
I mean, what do you think? You think they stand a chance? You're on their side, aren't you? Who are you betting on,
Magic mirror on the wall. Who is the fairest one of all?
Look at these lies.
One shall stand, one shall fall.
Even if one of them survives.
The only way to stop him is to make another movie.
Welcome to the Celluloid Mirror, a film discussion podcast presented by 4 Mile Circus, a full-cycle media services company based in Brooklyn, New York. In the Celluloid Mirror, we will look at two very different films to see what they reflect about one another and the audience. I am one of your hosts, Nicole Solomon.
And I am your other host, Sean Mannion. Today on the show, we're looking at Transformers the movie from 1986 and the 2007 remake of Funny Games. We'll give you a quick summary of each film, talk about the critical response to each, and then discuss the surprising things these two films have in common, breaking them down individually and collectively by shared themes. How are you doing, Nicole?
Oh, I'm doing good. I'm doing pretty good. I got some coffee, got some snacks, some seltzer. I finally watched the premiere of Lovecraft Country, which our listeners won't know this, but that premiered about 5 days ago.
Yeah, it premiered on Sunday. Yeah, we watched it Sunday night. It was so good.
It is now Friday.
Yes, it's now Friday.
Week. And very, very, very good. It's one of those shows that's kind of very exactly my shit in so many ways. And I also watched a movie called Losing Ground last night. Kathleen Collins, I'm going to double check her name, I believe is the name of the director. It was the one feature she did before she sadly died. Early film directed by a black woman. Not a lot of black women getting feature films made in 1982, unfortunately. I'm hoping maybe Criterion will release it on Blu-ray. It's a really interesting film. I do recommend it.
We've been watching ghost movies the last night. We watched...
You were going to watch The Frighteners, right?
Yeah, no, we watched Frighteners, we watched Sixth Sense. And yeah, just like ghosts and like what are rules around ghosts and stuff. Because my wife, Jess, is working on some ghost-related things. And so it's a research thing and also an excuse to be like, because of how the world is right now, like, what are we going to do tonight? I mean, there's probably other things we could do, but it just usually means like, what are we going to watch tonight? Because what else are we going to do with our lives?
Once in a blue moon, we play a board game. Once in a blue moon, we'll play Scrabble, at least. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's what are we going to watch? Because our listeners are probably aware of this, actually, but the whole world outside is on fire. Figuratively, but soon literally also.
You know, other parts of the world are not as on fire. Some of them are just smoldering.
You know what,
for some of them, they've made it a smaller fire. Some of them have made it just a little bit smaller.
But you know, the U.S. always has to be best, so
yeah, exactly. We have to somehow. We have the biggest on fire.
We have the most people dead every single day. But what we are talking about, I think, are some movies.
We're talking about movies.
We're talking about 2 movies.
2 movies?
What are the movies, though? I think I forgot.
You think you forgot what the movies are?
What would you like to talk about today? Which
What
2
would I like to talk about?
movies would you like to talk about in relation to one another?
Just off the top of our heads,
Yeah.
with just stuff that we know a lot about.
Yeah.
Well, I think we should talk about something like fun,
Mhm.
and something maybe a little less fun,
Cool.
depending upon your mood. Maybe something fun, like, it's in the title, funny games. That's a lot of fun.
Oh yeah, fun
That's a lot of
and
fun.
games together in one
It's
title.
in the title.
It's amazing.
It all goes together.
And then something maybe a little bit more disturbing, like
Yeah, something deeply disturbing, something concerning, like Transformers the movie from 1986.
oh yeah, I mean that's like you're a truck and then you're a person, but actually you're not alive at all.
And
But
now
yet
you're
you can still die.
Yeah. It is a slaughter for half an hour, and then sort of incomprehensible.
Well, then we'll talk about that. We'll talk about why
Let's
we
do those.
picked those films. But do we want to give like some quick synopses of?
Yeah, well, I can tell you a little bit about Transformers.
Cool, and then maybe I can talk about funny games.
That sounds good. That's like sharing the workload. So Transformers is a film, as you mentioned, about robots that are in disguise. They transform, they change themselves from robots into vehicles or weapons or sometimes insects or dinosaurs.
Don't
And
ever
these-
forget the dinosaurs.
Never forget the dinosaurs. They're delightful.
The Dinobots are a highlight, yes.
The Dinobots are delightful. In this film, in this 1986 film version, which takes place between the first and the second seasons of the second and the third seasons, of the ongoing television series at the time, it jumps forward to 2005, to the far future of 2005, where the battles between the evil Decepticons and the largely heroic Autobots continues. And it starts with a major sort of victory, maybe more of a draw between the two sides, where pretty much everybody dies. Every major character from the cartoon series, which is again only in its second season and about to go into its third, dies, including the main hero of the series, Optimus Prime, and the main villain of the series, Megatron, plus all sorts of other popular characters from it. They are cleared off the board, and new characters are brought in, including Hot Rod, who is voiced by Judd Nelson, and Megatron is replaced by Galvatron, voiced by Leonard Nimoy. And in the backdrop of all of this, there is Orson Welles as a planet-eating planet who is trying to get what is called the Autobot Matrix of Leadership, which is apparently like the whatever head of the Autobots has like a glowing ball in his chest, and he has to pass that on to the next one. And that's very important to Unicron, who's played by Orson Welles. And so after the fight that ends in a draw, the Autobots are kind of spread out across space, and the Decepticons are chasing them down. And it all culminates in a fight with Orson Welles' Unicron and Hot Rod, the new hero, taking over leadership after Robert Stack's Ultra Magnus. Such great names for these characters. Also can't defeat the evil Orson Welles. And so he rises up, and there's some rock and roll music, including a new version of the theme song by everybody's favorite metal band, Lion.
Definitely mine.
Yeah, who I can't think of any songs other than their version of the Transformers theme song.
That's all you need.
And everybody lives happily ever after, except the ones who died at the beginning. And they go on to have 2 more seasons of the show and about 20 more shows after that.
Wow, that sounds like a really sophisticated political allegory for our times.
It
We're gonna
is.
have
It
to have
is.
some levity, I think, to go with all that. A chance to, not have to think about why you're watching what you're watching
Yeah,
quite so
exactly.
much. And I think Funny Games would be good for that because
I think so.
that's it's a home invasion movie. It's a
Yeah,
good
who doesn't
old
want that?
home invasion movie. We are talking about Funny Games 2007, the U.S. version, not the German language version. We decided to do this version of Funny Games just now for a few reasons. Kind of, I think Sean and I both feel that it's a little bit more of the ultimate expression of the project of Funny Games for reasons that we will get into as we get into the discussion. It was always meant to be set in the US. The original version, if Haneke had had his way, it would have been in the US initially, and et cetera, et cetera. So let's go with that version. It stars Naomi Watts and Tim Roth as the Farbers. They're a financially well-off couple going with their son Georgie to their nice big summer house set up with a nice, really sophisticated security system. And they're there with their dog. And then these two dudes, played by Brady Corbett and Michael Pitt, show up. These two preppy guys, young men in tennis whites who look like they're from good families, very fine young people. Very fine people, as certain leaders are prone to say, you might say. And they kind of talk their way into the house and just gradually keep pushing the line and pushing the line and pushing the line until outright violence breaks out, and the Farbers end up being held captive in their own home by these two sadistic young men who play various sadistic, torturous games that, spoiler, alert, don't listen to this episode if you don't want to know everything that happens, both in Transformers and Funny Games. But honestly,
I did already give away Transformers. Your spoiler alert is after I already spoiled some stuff.
Well,
Good job, Nicole. Good
honestly,
job.
the very premise of this show spoils both movies in a lot of ways, as we will get to in a second. But it's a hard watch. It's meta commentary on genre conventions, on how violence is processed through media, on how audiences receive it, on film as a manipulative medium in and of itself, etc. We'll get into some of the specifics of how Haneke confronts the audience with how they are reacting to what they are watching and why in a moment, which kind of leads us to, I guess,
why did we pick these two films? Like, why did in this
what do they
moment?
have in common?
What do they have in common? Do you have any thoughts on that?
My thought is that, as we've discussed, they're two films that understand that the audience must suffer.
Yes, the audience, they deserve to suffer.
They deserve to suffer, and suffer they did. Reaction to this animated Transformers, it's a cult classic now. It's like fairly beloved now, but it was a commercial and critical disaster at the time, including like fans didn't like it because fans were little kids who are like, what the hell? You killed Optimus Prime. Kids were like crying about this, from what I've heard from people who were more into Transformers at the time than I. It was scandalous. It was shocking and horrifying. And it wasn't like, oh my God, you got to go see this. This is so grimdark Transformers or whatever. It was just like, what the hell? This is terrible. 80s kids weren't ready for that. They didn't want that. And the critics were just like, what the hell is this advertisement for toys? And we'll get into all that in a minute. But it's a film. I mean, you don't expect the protagonist of your TV series to die in Act 1 of the film adaptation.
No. And that is how it subverts its expectations. While you already kind of talked a little bit about how Funny Games does something similar, but it also had a similar negative reaction, particularly from critics. which we have so much that we can share from that. That's a whole dive into that we can do, and we'll only even have time just to scratch the surface, but really, really despised by many critics, and the film being a thriller that is about why, in many ways, is about why it's wrong to, maybe not wrong, but why it's disturbing to have a thriller movie in the first place, and that it's actually confronting the audience with its own penchant for violence, its own desire for violent content. It's directly confronting it, which makes a lot of people very uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable.
Yes, it's a film that uses so many of the conventions and tropes of its chosen genre in order to subvert them by denying the audience any of the cathartic pleasures we have come to expect from said genre. And so it's all the turning of the screws and none of the release, and as well as various other very pointed asides to the audience that make it very clear what Haneke's intentions are. So that's what these two films have in common, why we picked them. I just, no need to hold back on this. I think I can, not to speak for you, Sean, but I think we both like both of these movies.
Oh, yeah. I'm a big fan of both.
I just saw Transformers for the first time maybe a month or two ago. My friend Che did a remote cartoon salon, because that's the sort of thing that we all do now in the age of coronavirus, and shared the Transformers movie, which I've been meaning to watch forever, but it's a little hard to find these days, and I really enjoyed it. And Funny Games is, famously just one of my favorite films.
Similarly, I'm quite fond of both movies. I saw Funny Games when I was in film school. It was on Netflix at the time, and I was like, I think we watched Seventh Continent in class, and I was like, I want to see more from this guy, and I watched that on my own. And that was an interesting experience. Just like that sort of like, oh, you're telling me I'm a bad person. Okay, that's fair. And Transformers, the movie, I've seen so many times. I watched it initially as a small child. It was definitely something with my parents. I was like, oh no, we need to rent Transformers movie, and that was one of those movies that as a kid just watched over and over and over again from the rental. And currently I own like the 20th anniversary DVD, and somebody found some not usual print of it on VHS. I actually didn't think about it before, but I might actually have it right next to me here.
Ooh. Yeah.
Oh, there it is. There it is. Yeah. So, a version of Transformers the movie. This is, I don't know. It looks like it's a Canadian home video release from 1995.
Clamshell, though.
Yeah. So, I haven't actually tried to see if this still works or not.
For listeners at home, they're missing out on this beautiful, beautiful 90s Canadian clamshell edition of Transformers the movie on VHS.
But that's why we're doing this video for the Patreon members, which we'll talk more about later. But they can see shit. Haha.
Our Patreon subscribers definitely can see some shit.
Yeah. So big fan of both of the movies. Been a long time fan of Transformers the movie, and also sort of remember having probably a decade or so ago really thinking through like, oh, it's fucked up that like that movie starts with, in the first half an hour, just everybody dies.
So I think we could say the connection between Funny Games and Transformers is the subversion of audience expectations, yes?
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because it's kind of to two different ends, right? Almost opposite ends, if you will. Transformers' goal was the most pure crass commercialism you can think of. Haneke's goal was to puncture the Hollywood bubble of crass commercialization of violence, not to breed better consumers, but kind of the opposite, to breed more critical consumers. Funny Games uses the structure of like a horror or home invasion thriller movie while subverting the tropes of that genre and confronting the audience with its own desire to watch horror and violence, whereas for the sake of commerce, not converse, but probably converse too. There were
Converse
probably
also.
some Transformers converse.
Probably
shoes at some
eventually.
point. Yeah. And Transformers eliminates major characters from the franchise in the very first act of the film, handing the narrative over to new characters the audience was not expecting to follow.
Yeah, it's just from the outset there, both of them are, yeah, as you say, for different reasons, presenting the audience with one thing and then taking it away. In Transformers, it starts with almost like a hey, remember this character? Hey, remember this character? You play with this character. Here's this other character. Don't you love them all? Now they're fucking dead. Do you like Optimus Prime, kids? Look, he's here to save the day. Now he's fucking dead. What are you gonna do? Buy this new toy, you little shit.
Which is kind of the same structure as the Act 1 of Transformers is structurally similar to the entire duration of Funny Games, because Funny Games is, oh, here's this character. Oh, looks like maybe they're finally like getting a what's an idiom? I can't think of an idiom. Getting a leg up on their captors. Oh, she's got a gun. Oh, she's gonna blow him away. Oh my god, she blew him away. The most famous scene in the film. We'll talk about it in sub-depth later. Wow, I'm so relieved that this asshole finally got killed and Naomi Watts took control. No. Oh, they're just gonna undo that. They're just gonna be like, no, you don't get to have your catharsis. You don't get to see anyone get their comeuppance. You just get to see these characters that you increasingly are invested in the survival of get picked off one by one.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
similar.
Yeah, they're practically the same thing.
And they both,
but for very, as you say, for very different reasons. It's stated by the producers of Transformers that the directive to kill off all the characters came from Hasbro, the parent company, the toy company, because they wanted to introduce new characters.
Yeah, they were. The whole Transformers movie is designed to sell more violent toys, whereas Funny Games is designed to try to wake up audiences from mindless consumption of violence. So it's an interesting kind of like mirror through the looking glass version of one another of sorts. Also, one is very much for kids and one very much is not.
Yeah, I would never show Transformers the movie to a child.
How were these films received upon release? I mean, I think audiences mostly stayed away from the Transformers movie.
Mm-hmm.
Original Funny Games did okay, like, you know, as a controversial art house hit, but it was, I don't know if it was a hit, but I don't think it was a failure. But then the US remake
did not
perform.
But the original film also had some folks who were unhappy with it. We have a, would you like me to share a quote that we have set aside?
Oh, please do.
So from David Edelstein's review of the 2000 film.
So this is of the remake.
Of the remake of the film. He talks about his reaction to the 1998 film, which he received as and I think it's important to note this, a free screener. And his quote from his review is, "I watched to the end, removed the DVD from the player, and snapped it over my knee. Then, with a pair of scissors, I cut the halves into quarters, walked the pieces to the kitchen garbage can, and shoved them under the debris of the previous night's dinner. It only hit me later that my melodramatic response would have delighted the director. It takes a special kind of talent to drive a critic who enjoys zombie cannibal pictures to cry, 'Unclean.'" I'm sorry, unclean!
Full disclosure.
There was an exclamation point. I didn't.
Full disclosure. I have read this review multiple times. I think about this review, and especially this section of this review, with some frequency. I think about David Edelstein being so mad at Funny Games that he cut up the DVD. He broke it in half and then cut it up with scissors. What kind of scissors does he have is one question of mine. Like, were these like big garden shears? Like, what's he? And then he threw it away. Like, donate it to Housing Works or something, man. Like, you don't like the movie, fine, but that's just wasteful.
He was saving people from the movie. That's what he was doing.
It's just, I like the fact that he also specifically cites zombie cannibal pictures, because that's a fun, probably racist little, rabbit hole of violence to go down that apparently doesn't confront him with himself in any way, shape, or form. So
no, and it's also
it's very clean.
It's also interestingly that piece of his statement is also interestingly like one of those indications of like, I feel like you get what Funny Games is about, but you are so defensive about what the film is about that like you just can't quite bridge the gap. It's like,
yes,
the point of the movie is that the filmmaker is disturbed that you like zombie cannibal pictures. So the fact that it bothers you that much, yes, indeed was the point. And he even admits a few times, I think, that he gets that that was the point, but hates that that was the point.
I think and this I think is, while a particularly vivid review, I think it is representative of one of the most common general reactions across. We looked at a lot of reviews in preparation for this episode, which in part, like, I mean, this is not the first time I've gone down a Funny Games review rabbit hole. It is a film I like thinking about. It's a film I like reading what other people have said about. And for many years now, one of my great disappointments regarding this film is that so much of the critical reception is so repetitive and so limited. It's like the critic can't get past to say anything else about a film that, whether you like it or not, on a formal level is pretty impeccable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't think anyone can say that Haneke isn't an incredibly skilled filmmaker, whether they think what he's doing with those skills is good or evil. But they don't have anything to say other than, I'm so mad I had to watch this movie. And Haneke himself famously has said, if you walk out of this movie, you didn't need this movie. That's fine. It's not for you. So I'm kind of like, if you feel like you are actually okay with your relationship to cinema violence and you don't want to watch this film, but you have to sit through it because you're a critic and it's your job, can't you like take a minute to try to step away from the visceral experience of watching this movie? Because it's an upsetting movie. Unless you're like very dead inside, at least the first time you see it, either version, it's gonna be upsetting. It's gonna make you feel fucking bad, and that's what it's designed to do. And what so many of these reviews seem to do, though, is they I think maybe because they don't like the mirror that the film holds up on themselves, they have this compulsion to turn the mirror back around on Haneke and be like, well, I'm going to psychoanalyze you now. And why did you do this to me? Whereas my answer is like, well, if you don't really need this film, he's not really doing it for you. You just happen to be a film critic, so it's your job to gauge this. And it's your job to be able to deal with a wide range of films. Some of them might not be for you, and you should still be able to judge them on their own terms.
Yeah.
If you think the project is bad, that's fine. That can be a piece of your analysis. But these reviews don't generally get to a place of really even engaging with that question. They don't get past this initial defense, and they're just like, Haneke is a sadist. Haneke thinks he's better than me. Haneke is a bully, basically.
That one that Haneke thinks he's better than me it was an interesting, frequent appearance, whether it was explicitly stated or not. I noticed that several times. Like, he thinks he's better than me.
And you're like, he's not thinking about you at all.
No.
He's thinking about Quentin Tarantino fans. And if you are one, like, think about that maybe. I was reminded a lot, as a very brief sidebar, of the playwright Sarah Kane, who I like a lot, who did also made plays that were often very violent and disturbing, but were anti-violence plays.
Mhm.
They were not glamorizing violence. They were about trying to get audiences to see connections between different forms of violence in a way that I think Haneke does a lot too, seeing connections between global violence and domestic violence, things like that, which is something Haneke absolutely does. I think in Benny's video, he does that very explicitly. But Funny Games is kind of in keeping with this is a theme of his. Haneke is, whether you like him or not, I would say a filmmaker with a moral compass who, by his own admission, makes films about things that frighten him.
Yeah.
He's very concerned with violence, and he thinks about how he as a filmmaker can engage with that. But he's interested in violence in film, but I just, people focus on that a lot, and he's interested in violence in general.
Mm-hmm.
He's working in film, and I think that's why that comes up so often as, you know, a site, a location for dealing with violence. But you know, he like Sarah Kane. I also, I think it's interesting because they both said really negative things about Quentin Tarantino.
Mm-hmm.
As people who were working in the 90s, and suddenly he was like commercial success, critical success, beloved by audiences, making these really entertaining, sometimes ultra-violent films that some people who also work in the realm of violence, maybe with a little bit more of a moral framework than I think Quentin Tarantino has. I don't think he has a moral framework. You know, I think he makes very, very high budget personal fetish porn, basically. But I think he is emblematic of the kind of popcorn, edgelord, entertaining, fun violence that artists like Kane, who has been frequently censored, and, you know, there was a lot of outrage, very similar to the Funny Games critical outrage against her first play, Blasted. There was very similar critical, what is this atrocity? How could you do this to us? Kind of thing, when it's a very moral play. As Funny Games, I think, is as well. We can disagree about things. I find it a useful check on myself, honestly, as somebody who also is concerned with violence and likes a lot of violent entertainment, but not in an uncritical way where, like, when I was in high school, I kind of was like, well, I don't think violence in film necessarily causes violence in real life, so everything's fine. Nothing more to see here, nothing more to think about here. Never need to revisit this set of issues again. Just going to be defensive about it, you know?
Yeah, it's unfortunately the sort of conversation that that a lot of people just won't let you have. Like, because the assumption is if you're criticizing it, you're saying that by necessity, violence in film or violence in video games or violence on television or whatever must produce violence in reality, in real life. But we can have a conversation about how it's impactful or how it's potentially dangerous or potentially detrimental to people's mental health on some level, without it necessarily being like, oh yeah, you're going to watch a movie about somebody getting stabbed and then you're going to stab some people.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't have to be that.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a one-to-one correlation like that. And also, it's not like the concept of artistic responsibility necessarily leads to an argument for censorship, which a lot of people seem to just like make that jump over that abyss.
Jump straight there. Like, and I stopped wading into, especially like just in the online sphere where you don't know what fucking moron you're gonna end up talking to. But yeah, like, I stopped wading into conversations where I'm critical about things. I'm like, I think this is questionable as far as like what it's saying or what it might be suggesting to to people, and people are like, well, we can't censor things. No, but we can have a conversation about the thing that does exist. Me talking about something does not censor it. It still fucking exists. It still made a lot of money, Joker.
Have you watched that yet?
No, I'm not gonna watch that movie.
One thing that we might want to discuss a little bit with our listeners is in connection to what we were just discussing about Funny Games reception, and the inability of certain critics to get past this initial just angry defensiveness, is a lot of times in their anger they end up making Haneke's point for him in the reviews, not in the David Edelstein way where he's like, and Haneke probably wanted me to cut up this DVD, and I'm like, I don't even think that's anywhere in it. He didn't make this movie to piss off critics. No. I do not think that was his motivation. I think he didn't care if that happened, but that wasn't the goal. And a lot of people, I think, treat Haneke like he's just a troll. And right. I don't...
They treat him like he's Lars von Trier.
Yes. Yes. That's yes, correct. But then they end up telling on themselves in these critics. Like, if I can read from this Slate review, rarely have I hated a movie villain like I loathed the preening, entitled douchebag that Michael Pitt plays in the movie. I distracted myself from the pain of watching the Farbers suffer, meaning he distracted himself from the movie he was watching, by imagining novel ways to reduce his cherubic face to mincemeat.
Just way missing the point, but okay.
I was so mad that I didn't actually get to see graphic violence on screen, that I had to imagine it. Because Funny Games, it's a violent film, it's a disturbing film. There is not much graphic violence we see on screen.
No.
In the film. It almost all happens off screen. We hear it, we see the aftermath of it, and that's very intentional, which is part of why, to circle back to David Edelstein, this film is often referred to as, by a little phrase that I know you and I both love so very much, torture porn.
Yeah, well, because you see, it's bad because it has torture, which you don't like torture, right? And it's porn, which, you know, like...
don't want to censor it, but it's bad.
Yeah, it's bad. It's like, you know, it's one of those shitty manipulative phrases where they're trying to force you to agree with them by choosing a name that makes it sound really bad.
And it doesn't. And torture porn, for anyone who's not clear on this, another David Edelstein review that I've revisited a few times is one of, maybe it was Devil's Rejects or something like that. He wrote a piece where he coined the term torture porn. Film critic David Edelstein coined the term torture porn in a New York Magazine article published on January 26, 2006. The article cites the films Hostel, The Devil's Rejects, Saw, Wolf Creek, and The Passion of the Christ as examples of a new trend in which, quote-unquote, explicit scenes of torture and mutilation that were once confined to the old 42nd Street now have terrific production values and a place of honor in your local multiplex.
Oh, and we'll get back to the robots in disguise soon, we promise.
In my opinion, and I believe yours as well, Sean, this is a bad term. It's a bad term for the reasons you just said. There's baked in assumptions that porn is bad, which I don't subscribe to, and it also lumps together any film that's gory and or violent that the viewer doesn't like, and gives them a way of dismissing it, being like, this is just violence porn. You know, the torture is oddly specific. I think it had to do with it being like a post-Iraq war moment and some stuff that was in the ether, why that's what got...
Wasn't it Hostel, or am I thinking that maybe he just applied it to Hostel? Okay.
I think it got applied to Hostel, I think, in that initial piece. That was definitely one of the first films it was applied to, but it wasn't... People often say, like, act as if that term was coined for Hostel, and it wasn't. Okay. It was coined to refer to, like, an emerging trend. Yeah. As Edelstein saw it. I definitely remember he included The Devil's Rejects in it, because that's one that doesn't get mentioned quite as frequently. Usually people are just like Saw and Hostel. It's talking about those kinds of films. But the thing is, from its inception, it wasn't only talking about these new, very mainstream films that featured more graphic scenes of violent torture than we were used to getting this much of at the multiplex. That was a real trend that happened. It's totally fine to talk about it. I don't know if torture porn is the most useful framework for discussing those films, but even from its inception, it wasn't even only about those.
Yeah.
And Edelstein himself, I believe, has used that term to refer to funny games, which is like just shows the complete uselessness of that term, because like funny games may be a lot of things. It's not pornography. I mean, I'm not saying there's not someone out there who can jerk it to funny games, because there's someone out there who can jerk it to everything on Earth. But
I mean, it does have Tim Roth.
It does have Tim Roth. Naomi Watts is very pretty. But Haneke's intention in this film was the opposite of pornography. Most porn, like, they were trying to make porn. That's usually how that works. They were trying to make something for purposes of sexual gratification. This was designed for the purposes of, like, no gratification, except maybe the intellectual gratification of grappling with it afterwards, which is why, like, I always tell people it's one of my favorite films. It's easier for me to watch now because I've seen it enough times that I can focus on the technical elements or things like that, rather than being quite so viscerally in the story that is so disturbing. But it's not a film I recommend to everybody, you know, because like not everybody needs to watch every film that's good. And it's a punishing brutal ride. And I'm upfront with people about it when I talk about it. I'm not like, oh my God, you have to watch funny games. I'm like, this is what it is. If you're up for that, I will tell you that for me, despite it being unpleasant, it has given me so much to think about.
Yes.
And that is worth so much to me. And also, it's an example of a filmmaker just really, I want to say, as with Transformers, but I don't know that I can really say this about Transformers, who's really working with the medium and trying to do new things with it rather than staying stuck in the same formulas and the same. Yeah. Like, how do we use the manipulation of cinema, you know, to wake the audience up rather than lulling them into, you know, their comfort zone, whether that comfort zone is the roller coaster of a home invasion movie or the more comfort food of a rom-com, or whatever the expectations are. We have expectations we bring to film as entertainment, and Haneke is trying to make it more than just entertainment. And I have to respect that. I think people are like, that's pretentious. And I'm like, you know what? Give me pretentious. Give me something. You all are giving me nothing. You're just wasting like hundreds of millions of dollars to make the same crap that's already been made and nobody really feels that strongly about, but it goes down easy. No entendres attended.
Similar to funny games, as we were talking about, there was some unpleasant critical reaction to the first Transformers when we talked about how it was a bomb, and actually specifically Leonard Maltin referred to it as a bomb in his movie guide, and said it was quote, little more than an obnoxious feature-length toy commercial. That deafening rock score certainly doesn't help.
Oh, that's rude.
I mean, Lion worked hard for you, as well as Stan Bush. But
he has the touch.
He has the touch. He has the power. It was a lot harder to find contemporary reviews for Transformers than for funny games. There's we had so many.
Why?
We had so many for funny games that I think we had to like go like, all right, we're gonna have to set a lot of these aside and not listen to them.
And we also had a lot of feelings about the stuff we were reading about funny games. We could do a whole podcast.
We could just do funny
series
games.
About funny games, honestly.
But
if you want that, listeners, just let us know, because
we could do it. We could do it. Karen James also though wrote at the same time, at the time of release about the film. There's an interesting acknowledgement in it, which is something I think that we can explore in a little bit, which is acknowledging that there's Transformers was, well, she did not enjoy it. It participates in sort of a larger, arguably interactive story that's enhancing the experience for the children that were there. And there was a couple of notes about that. I even remember, I don't have the quote for it, but I believe it was on Roger Ebert's review of actually the 2007 movie or one of the sequels. He was referring to this as well, but Karen James said, unlike most movie stars, though, the Transformers have off-screen lives and personalities that their fans will carry with them to the theater. Children have an advantage here, for they can project their playtime scenarios on the old friends and heroes in action on the screen, while parents may just wonder what the fuss is about. So there's an interesting, I mean, this is different than what's Funny Games, but both are also engaging with beyond the screen. Transformers engaging sort of with a meta-narrative beyond the screen, and Funny Games engaging philosophically beyond the screen. Both not well received, but I think the reaction to Transformers since certainly reflects what Karen James was talking about how there is a life beyond it, and even like sort of beyond like what children playing with toys or maybe watching the cartoon. Also, the fact that there were 2 more seasons of the TV show of that version of Transformers. There's been multiple versions of Transformers since this movie. And in the 2 seasons since then, I think on some level, many of the characters who were popular, who died in the movie, somehow came back. Optimus Prime gets resurrected. Starscream, who's like Megatron's like second in command, who dies, comes back as a ghost. And there's like a storyline, I haven't actually watched those episodes, but a storyline where he's a ghost. Even Unicron is like present, and I think sort of comes back to life by the end of the series. I can't confirm that because I can't remember, but I remember reading something about that. So this sort of life beyond it, and there was an acknowledgement of it, but also just sort of a dismissal of like, oh, like this is terrible. Like, what is this? This isn't for us.
And interestingly, though, both films, those aspects of it, the engagement beyond just what's on the screen, the larger context, they were both a little ahead of their time in terms of that. Transformers, and that a version of this has kind of become the dominant mode of at least like mega budget commercial film storytelling, right? If you look at like the Marvel Cinematic Universe and its interaction with the broader Marvel universe, or Star Wars, where you've got films, you've got toys, you've got comic books, you've got novels, you've got TV shows, you've got all these different forms of stories that are informing whatever you're watching on the screen. And that didn't used to be normal back in the 80s. You would have to make you'd have to at least, you know, have a fig leaf of this film can stand alone, and you don't have to have been like following a toy series to understand it. And now that's totally normal. And similarly, the kind of meta commentary of Funny Games it was not unprecedented, but it was a lot newer. Like this original Funny Games came out shortly after like the original Scream, for example. Which was, of course, after Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which was after any number of other films that, you know, did a kind of meta horror commentary thing. But after that became very, very common, to the point now where it's almost not even commented on. This sort of like meta commentary, maybe especially with horror and thrillers, which is an interesting topic of why that is. That's just become so normal. It's very normal to see like these meta in-jokes in horror movies. Like it's expected at this point, that are often poking fun at the tropes and conventions of the genre, but usually poking fun, not like we are going to rub your face in your own filth the way Haneke does it.
Yeah, exactly. And in that sense, like both films, they produce a reaction or produced a reaction in the audience because of kind of the nature of the films. One being to push a certain commercial narrative that was all about what was beyond what was on screen, being an advertisement, as many dismissively referred to it, which is completely legitimate. And then the other one, as we've said, is criticizing the enjoyment of the very type of genre it participates in, which I think is an interesting thing to talk about in terms of what makes both of these films sort of shocking and effective in the way that they're shocking is the fact that they reinforce genre conventions and sort of story cycles and subvert them. They sort of play both sides, which is what you kind of have to do in order to subvert. I think in order to subvert these genre conventions, story cycles, is you also have to actually do it. It has to be like a good horror movie that actually undermines or questions the conventions of horror movie also has to be a horror movie.
Yeah, Funny Games is hitting the beats. It's just it hits the beats and then it twists things.
Exactly. It hits
and then
the beats.
The next,
yeah. Go ahead.
It's like, sorry. We're going to show you this knife. That knife is not going to be used the way you think it's going to be used.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. But it's there for the exact same reason that it's usually there. It's there for that very like, oh, hey, we're going to do something.
It's there to inspire hope so that hope can then be quashed.
Exactly.
Which is kind of what he does over and over and over again throughout the film. It's a mm-hmm. brutal, punishing film.
Yeah.
And it's also, I think, worth noting, like, I think you and I, Sean, both like a lot of films that are, I think Funny Games is a masterful film. I think mm-hmm. there are a lot of films I love that I would not call masterful. Transformers potentially might be one of them, although I really love the animation. It's beautiful. I've got a lot of positive things to say about Transformers. I'm not
mm-hmm.
talking shit. I'm not saying it's so bad it's good or something like that at all. But Funny Games kind of does exactly what it set out to do. Yes. I don't know that it has the impact societally that Haneke would like it to, but it does to the viewer mm-hmm. exactly what he was intending. Transformers, at least initially, did the opposite. Right? But that's part of what makes it so good, is it's this happy accident. Transformers ends up being a much more interesting movie because of this commercial miscalculation, where they're like, kids will be fine with all the characters they love dying as long as we give them new crap to buy.
Yeah.
But it ends up then making the story interesting, because you're like, I was not expecting Optimus Prime to die. I was not expecting this to be a story about having to, like, rebuild in that sort of bleak.
Right. Yeah.
And you've got the gravitas of Orson Welles and Leonard Nimoy, and, it's a lot of interesting stuff, but it's a little bit on accident that it turned out as interesting as it did, whereas Funny Games is just, like, followed the blueprint by design, does exactly what he was trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that came up in our research that we shared was the essay from Umberto Eco from the 70s, I want to say, called The Myth of Superman, which is all about story cycles and Superman and mythology and how they work or don't. He talks about that pleasure is derived in certain kinds of media and storytelling from the repetition of that framework.
Yep.
And like, these movies are popular. Like, people complain, I think, I see complaints about, like, oh, all the Marvel movies, like, it's the same movie, it's the same structure. And it's like, that's the point. That is exactly the point. That is what they exist for. They're not going to, they're going to change around the building blocks in the middle, but it's supposed to fit a framework, because that is the point. That is what makes it, that is sort of pleasurable. If you shift it too much, you make a different kind of movie, which can also work, which can also be a lot of fun, but isn't really the point of these. Kind of, this genre is this repetitious thing.
And that's true of so many genres, right? That's
so
true
many.
Of rom-coms. That's true of revenge fantasy films,
Horror
that's
movies
certainly full of
in general.
buddy cop movies. Like, there's a million genres, and You can subvert the conventions of the genre. That can be a great thing to do. You also can just make a solid example of that genre for people who like that genre to enjoy.
Yeah, and it's not, yeah, as you're saying, it's not unique. It's really everything. Every drama, every family drama, every, like, I mean, honestly, every Oscar movie.
Absolutely.
Like,
the structure can be a little easier to see, I think, in some versus others, but you know, this really does cut across.
Yeah.
A lot, most, if not all, commercial filmmaking.
Yeah, it's
virtually all.
Yeah, the structure is kind of the point, and it's you know, and it's part of storytelling in general, and it's sort of like an old convention of storytelling. I can't remember where exactly this came from. I should have looked it up. But there was some convention of in a particular culture. I guess I'm gonna have to look this up at some point. But I remember it from college, where they're talking about you were supposed to tell a story, but you were supposed to tell a story and hit certain beats. You could change things in the middle, but you're just supposed to hit certain beats. Always hit these beats. That's the point. If you don't do it, you're bad. You're a bad storyteller. That's old. That's been around forever. I mean, like oral storytelling, you would have like, oh, I'm going to tell the story of Hercules. I'm going to tell the story of whoever, Odysseus, Batman. Yeah, Batman. Exactly. If it was just having a text conversation with our mutual friend about Batman, where I was talking about, yeah, it's just the same shit over again. And like vary it up a little bit if you're going to repeat it, because they're talking about, there's a lot of jokes on Twitter about how they're going to be exploring how the origin of Batman affected him emotionally. His trauma about it. Like, we haven't already done that a million times. What are they going to do with that? But like,
so probably show it in slow motion. So how do Transformers and funny games relate to the myth of Superman?
So I think it's that, in
your mind,
it's that you know, in there he's talking about the framework, and that there's some flexibility in the framework. There's room for innovation, and that the reason that these get negative reviews initially is because of breaking the framework. That that funny games, it's a horror movie, it's structured like a horror movie, but it keeps undermining the horror. And funny games, Transformers is participating in a cycle. Being, you know, it's coming from a half-hour TV show where every episode, like, here's the heroes, here's the villains, there's a conflict, it's resolved. And so it's building off of that, it's building off of expectations for that. And then it starts the same way. Here's the heroes, here's the villains, there's a conflict. Now everybody's dead, and there's no resolution. And the beginning of the movie then becomes this sort of breaking of that. Transformers being different in that it reasserts its story cycle again as sort of a passing of the baton with the Hot Rod character we talked about, but which I think is one of the reasons why it has then become in the long term beloved, because it still reasserts.
So it reinforces story cycles, even as it subverts them, and perhaps it must.
I think so. I think for it to continue as it has, it had to have done, like, if it just was like, no, everybody's dead, that's it, the movie's over, everybody's dead, I think it would be, I think we wouldn't even be talking about it. Like, I think it would have broken it down so much that it would be this obscure little failed cartoon that people are like, yeah, have you seen that? It's weird. They killed all the characters, and then that was it. But
Transformers does function as a, like, cartoon adventure film.
Absolutely.
It's just a very disturbing.
It's very disturbing.
One.
It clears the board at the beginning.
We should talk a little bit, I think, about rejection of a passive audience on the part of both of these films, because I think that's another really important commonality between them that we've touched on a little bit, but didn't really go into specifically.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Transformers, obviously, is viewing, it's kind of funny to say Transformers rejects a passive audience, because the activity they're expecting on the part of the audience that this film is designed to provoke is as consumers.
Yes.
Exclusively. Unless you want to say as fans as well, or something, as if there's any separation between those two things. Like, this film is designed so that kids will go out and buy products and continue to consume Transformers media, whereas, Funny Games is trying to confront the audience with their own complicity in the violence being shown on screen, right? And saying, like, you are not just... Funny Games is saying, you're not just sitting here watching this. You have some responsibility to the fact that this is even happening in front of your eyes. What are you going to do about that? I mean, Funny Games is trying to provoke people to either walk out or think about what you've done, I would say. But thinking about what I've done is, sometimes one of my favorite pastimes. So that's just fine with me. I'm not going to cut up any DVDs anytime soon.
Why not? You really got to declare something with that. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think both of them are dealing with, as you say, the passive, the idea of the passive audience. One being like, you're for us to advertise to. You sit there, we feed you a story, and then you go and buy stuff that's from the story. But that's sort of the original intent behind it, but the actual execution, as we talked about, it sort of accidentally becomes the opposite, because it almost and I think there's a degree to which this happened. If we look at the Transformers media that comes after it, there's a degree to which the audience, because of how they started with, like, okay, let's clear it and here's new toys, is put in a position where they actually reject the premise of it. They're like, no, you don't get to decide who dies. And kind of going back to what Karen James was saying about how there's this sort of meta narrative, each individual viewer, almost at least as much as any other film, if not more, each individual viewer is coming in it with their own sort of narrative conception to start. They're like, yeah, no, I have had my own stories with Optimus Prime and Megatron, where they're fighting, and I've had my own adventures that go beyond this movie already, that I've created, and then, like, this movie can't change those. So there's like there's a higher level of interactivity, perhaps, in this case, with that movie, because there is that engagement. There's that level of engagement, which is both the point of the movie, but undermining the point of the movie. The point of the movie is to get them to do that, spend money so you can play with the toys. But then the toys themselves undermine the approach to commerce that they have, which is like, no, you need new toys now. But the established sort of route that they have undermines that. And then you've got, as you say, Funny Games.
Funny Games disrupts the consumer relationship to genre cinema, right?
Yeah.
Like, Funny Games makes it a little harder the next time you watch a home invasion movie to just enjoy the thrill ride. That's what it's designed to do. It's disrupting a consumer pattern. I think maybe, arguably, Haneke is hoping to end consumer demand for some kinds of entertainment in some sort of fantasy ultimate goal. So it's kind of like the inverse of what Transformers is trying to do. And Funny Games is repeatedly confronting the audience with the fact that they're watching a film. Most famously, I think the most famous sequence in the film is about halfway through, where Naomi Watts finally shoots one of the two and gets a hold of the gun, shoots one of the two home invaders, blows him away. Reportedly, I've never seen this film in a theater, but reportedly audiences would cheer at this moment. And then the other killer literally picks up a remote control, rewinds the film, or in the US version, it's like a DVD going backward. They change the visual that, you know, literally calling attention to like the medium of the images in front of you. And lack of control, like with Transformers, where it's like, well, you don't get to decide who lives or who dies. It is the same thing in funny games. And it's like, oh, you don't get that cathartic release of getting to see her blown away. We're going to have to wrap this up, so I won't go too deep into this. But honestly, for a film I love so much, for me, one of the potential criticisms of funny games might be the way in which it collapses different forms of violence into each other. I've heard so frequently that moment referred to as confronting the audience with the fact that they had just cheered on a murder.
Mm-hmm.
And my mind is like, that's not a murder, though. I'm not saying that means the point of confronting the audience with their reaction to Naomi Watts blowing the, you know, killer away. I'm not saying that's not a useful moment. I'm not saying I dislike it. I'm not saying I have a problem with it in and of itself. I do have a problem with framing it as you just cheered on a murder.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, no, that was self-defense. And
Yeah.
I am not a pacifist. And I think it is very important that we say that people, maybe especially sometimes women people, like, it is okay to value your own life more than that of somebody who is harming you.
Yeah.
I actually think that's a very important core moral value of mine. And so, you know, Naomi Watts is right to blow away the guy. Does that mean that's right to be a form of entertainment we take in? I think that's a complicated question.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think the answer is it's just blanket wrong. I don't think Haneke is thinking about how his films resonate, funny games especially, with different sorts of gendered violence and abuse, both physical and psychological, that get brought up when these two killers are gaslighting the Naomi Watts character. Specifically, the egg scene is one of my favorite scenes in all of film, and it's in part because I'm like, oh my god, a version of this has happened to me so many times, and this is the best cinematic depiction I have ever seen of this. This is useful. And so, you know, I am all for being critical of violent entertainment. I think it's just healthy, good mental hygiene to think about things. But I do not think I share Haneke's position that enjoying cathartic violent entertainment is necessarily bad. I think it's actually a corrective and useful intervention in some cases for some people, especially people who historically have been subject to systemic violence of various sorts. I think being able to imagine turning that around is actually, you know, it may be unpleasant, but I am not convinced that it is bad. And that would be one of my potential critiques of the film. Potential, it's, you know.
Right, but I think that there's also like, and I think we have already kind of talked about this, is like, just because we don't necessarily agree that it is on its face a bad thing, doesn't mean that we can't like appreciate that, like somebody saying like, okay, but like let's question it, because I think that there's definitely like a level of like there's a difference between like watching it and like actually like engaging with it and questioning, is this something that we should talk about? Is this something that is, you know, the rightness or wrongness of the actions on the screen, versus the other side of it, which we've already kind of touched on a little bit, which is people who are like, no, it's just that. It's just there on the screen, and it's only that, and it has no impact beyond, because we know that films have an impact. We know that media and art and all of that has an impact on the viewer, the consumer, the however you want to phrase it. Like, we know that this is a thing because we feel it. We could dig up studies on it, but we feel it when we watch a movie that upsets us or something like that. It's not all of these things are absorbed as experience that we process and work from. Like, it becomes part of our lives.
Absolutely. And I am so grateful for this film provoking these sorts of questions and conversations. I'm rarely happy about a conversation that something starts about an issue.
Yeah.
But in the case of funny games, I'm very happy about the many conversations, including this one. And I think my point is potentially less a criticism of the film than a disappointment with some of the discourse surrounding the film.
Yeah. And I think that there's like, just to kind of bring it all back to this sort of why we're talking about these two films is like, we're talking about audience reaction, we're talking about audience impact, both in the sense of like what was intended, what was not, why was it intended the way it was intended. And I think that both films are successful in addressing their audiences, one unintentionally, but I think it has proven itself to be successful in addressing its audience. Transformers, because of over time, it's probably the highest regarded piece of Transformers media, certainly higher regarded than the live action films. And I think it's sort of had that impact, and also the way that it interacts with sort of the larger narratives of that franchise, and how it, as you said, is more reflective of how the franchises and these things have evolved. I think it's been very successful in addressing its audience. I think that Haneke's film is also successful in addressing its audience. I would argue because of how, like, in a way, because of how virulently critics despised it.
And unlike Transformers, which you're saying now, it's probably the most highly regarded piece of Transformers media, and Funny Games is probably the most polarizing, the pair of them, the 90s and 2000s version, especially the US remake, which is not regarded as well as the original on balance. But his films in general, they are frequently polarizing, but not to this degree. They generally are well reviewed. And these are movies a lot of people hate. I mean, like, Benny's Video was controversial. That's polarizing, not to this extent. The Seventh Continent, any of those are not. And then, you know, once he started making French language films, he started being more of a critic's darling. Funny Games remake, to the contrary, you know, Cachet, Code Unknown, those were huge critical and art house successes. And then, you know, White Ribbon was nominated for Oscars. Amore was nominated for Oscars, which is kind of mind-blowing when you watch Funny Games. The last thing you're thinking is Oscar movie. But so Funny Games, the intentional success, Transformers, the accidental success. Accidental success has really been elevated.
Yeah.
And the intentional success is kind of still down here, and they're like, oh, what's that unclean movie?
Which is unclean, which is kind of the success of the movie. Like, if it became, it's almost like if it became sort of conventionally successful, it would be unsuccessful.
If it was enjoyable.
Yes, if it was enjoyable, it would have, yeah.
So we should probably wrap this up.
Yeah. So I think that there's a good conversation about it, a good sort of start off to this thing that we're doing.
So I think we would love to hear what the audience thinks about Transformers and Funny Games, wouldn't we?
Yeah, we would actually. And there were even a couple questions, and maybe we didn't get to them, but maybe we can pose them to the audience.
Yeah, let's do that. That's a good idea.
So the questions that we noted that we didn't get around to, and we'd love to hear from people about, are Peter and Paul of Funny Games essentially the live action version of internet trolls and online harassment? So think about, like, if you've seen the movie, presumably you should see the movie. How is their behavior, particularly in the beginning of the movie, very much like internet trolls, online harassment? The other question we've got is, does the nostalgia and positive view of Transformers today hinge on that the shocking beginning of the film was ultimately not permanent? We kind of talked about around this, but I'm interested to hear what people have to say. And what was that? Yeah.
No, there's one other. We touched on this, but we didn't exactly engage the question.
Right.
Where
Yeah.
Haneke famously commented at the Q&A following the screening of the original Funny Games at Cannes, but I think this applies to both versions of Funny Games quite clearly. He said, anyone who leaves the cinema doesn't need the film. Anyone who stays does. What do we think about this? Do we agree? Do we disagree? What does it say that I've sat through this film many times.
Many times. And
so hit us up.
Yeah, what do you think about those? Would you have other questions or comments or other ways that you would like to do it?
Suggestions for future double features?
Thank you for joining us, and let us know what you think, and leave rates, reviews, and subscribes. And we'll see you guys later.
Happy watching and listening.
Thanks for joining us for our first episode of the Celluloid Mirror.
Please rate, review, and subscribe to the show on your platform of choice.
Don't forget to reach out and let us know what you think about those questions. You can email us at info@4milescircus.com. Reach out to us on social media. We're 4 Mile Circus on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.
Or go to anchor.fm/the Celluloid Mirror to leave us a voice message we can play on a future episode.
For early access to uncut video of our podcast discussion and so much more, you can subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/4milescircus.
I ended up in that hall reverse. There was another girl. She looked like me. Exactly like me.
Can you come after me and join us?
What happens when the story dies? The evil is set free.
I have to return some video.